I'm not saying that people should be too soft on themselves, because obviously there is a time to push, but actually there's got to be a counterbalance. We've got to be able to move between, just as you said, Greg, recognizing when is this a push time, when is this a recovery time.
Welcome to the Greg Bennett Show, presented by Volridge Health. I'm your host, Greg Bennett, and today I am joined by the incredible Dr. James Hewitt. James is a world-leading human performance scientist, a keynote speaker who brings science-based strategies to help people and organizations reach their full potential. With his experience ranging from Formula One teams to Fortune 500 companies, James is at the forefront of research on high performance and well-being. He integrates endurance sports, neuroscience, and psychology insights to reveal how personal health fuels business success. I'm thrilled to have him back on the show to dive deeper into his research, his experiences, and what's new in the field of human performance. So, without further ado, welcome. Thanks for joining me on the Greg Bennett Show once again, Dr. James Hewitt. How are you, mate? And I like doctor, by the way.
Ooh, yeah, thanks for that introduction, Greg. It was really great to speak with you again. And it's always fun when someone kind of shares what you're doing and gives you all these kind of accolades. But yeah, I'm doing really well. And it's been a really interesting year. Lots of interesting projects. It does feel like human performance in this whole space is just really exploding at the moment in a good way. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to diving into our conversation today. I think we've got a lot of interesting things to talk about.
I can't wait, mate. And like I just said, you finished your PhD. You mentioned that just pre-show. We threw in doctor in front of your name. How's it feel to finally have that done? Finished.
It is great. It's been a long process. I mean, it started really not long after I finished my undergraduate degree. And my plan initially was to go and work for a few years, figure out what I wanted to do, and then come back and do a PhD. But somehow, that turned into basically 10 years. And I went and just worked in industry, worked in a commercial context, but that desire to kind of go deep and answer some questions that had always intrigued me about, particularly around the connection between well-being and performance, just never went away. So being able to go back and do that PhD and finally get it, really feels like I've closed the loop on a lot of topics, which I'd always been really eager to understand more about.
So tell us real quick, the PhD was in what specifically?
So the broad domain is performance science, but I focus specifically on performance in the workplace. So what I describe as knowledge work, that's work where we think for a living, and really drilled into this question of how does well-being relate to performance in some of the most demanding workplaces, based on this hypothesis that rather than well-being and performance being in conflict with each other, they should be complementary. And so I explored that hypothesis by using something called digital phenotyping, so gathering psychological, physiological, neurocognitive, behavioral measures, and trying to understand what were the biggest predictors or blockers of sustainable high performance in those environments. And I'm pleased to say that my hypothesis was true. Well-being and performance can be complementary rather than working against each other.
I love it. And I want to dive right into all of this, because now I've gone and got myself a full-time job with an office and everything else. I'm actually now able to take everything we're going to talk about today and put it into practice, and get the team on board. Fortunately, at Volridge Health, the company I'm with, we have Volridge Investment Management on one side, and they're just, Volridge Health is sort of the startup arm of the data-driven science that we're doing. And they've got a pretty good concept around health and well-being. Being here in Jupiter, Florida, everybody's got the stand-up desks and the walking treadmills, and I'm quite impressed with how far they've come along as a company. So it's pretty cool. But we'll dive into that in a little bit. Like you mentioned, the last 18 months since you were last on, almost 18 months ago. You've been busy. What have been some of the highlights since we last spoke? I know you've been working with aerospace to finance and everything else in between. What are some of the experiences stand out?
Yeah, so I've been working on some really interesting projects across quite a few different sectors. So, my bread and butter is really in what I'd call high performance knowledge work. So in whether that's consulting, financial services. I've also continued to do some quite interesting work in a sporting context as well, both in alpine skiing, but also in motorsport, including in Formula One. And then I'm also involved in some quite interesting hospitality projects as well, looking at kind of high performance in that sector. So it's been really diverse, but the core of everything is all about what are the building blocks that are going to enable people to perform their best in a way that's sustainable, and performing physically, performing cognitively, looking at how those two factors interact with each other, and doing it on a really strong evidence base as much as possible. So I think some of the interesting developments relate to some research which has been emerging, both some of my own data, but also in related fields that other great researchers are producing, but also some of these mega trends that I see in human performance. And in particular, it seems that there's this huge demand for science-based tools, strategies, products. Some of that, which I think is quite positive. Some comes with some challenges, which maybe we can talk about as well. But overall, it seems that people they're kind of wrestling with this problem, I think. And the problem, I'd maybe sum it up in the sense that people feel like they're working longer than ever before, but somehow they've got less time than ever. And even though they're focused more than ever before on things like their sleep and spending more on sleep than ever, somehow that kind of restorative rest kind of slips through their fingers. And it seems like many people feel like caught between these tensions. And I often describe it as, we're stuck in this always on world, stuck often between extremes where, on one hand, people feel like they either need to optimize everything or on the other, they kind of, give up. And often people oscillate between the two in something called a triangular relapse pattern is what you call it from a behavioral perspective, where there's this kind of initiation of enthusiasm. We see all kinds of people trying new ideas, sharing their protocols on social media, but then they start to encounter some challenges. It becomes difficult to sustain. Then they start to get a little bit disillusioned. They face these setbacks and then they kind of give up and they say, oh, it's too hard. And, they might even do what's called kind of quiet quitting. They just start doing the bare minimum to get by. And then eventually the kind of guilt hits and they kind of restart that cycle again when, a new idea comes along. There's a new protocol, a new routine which they want to try. So a lot of what I've been trying to do, depending on the context that I'm in, is to help people to kind of cut through some of that noise and find this third way that avoids those extremes, a way that's still science-based, but is more sustainable to try and break that triangular pattern of relapse that it does seem that, unfortunately, quite a lot of us get stuck in.
It's so interesting, isn't it? This whole area of, with your background as, cycling and then coming into this space, my background in triathlon and coming more into this corporate world. And I think we talked about it last time, about how in when we build our training blocks for our physical body, we're often looking at 4-year and 8-year sustainable training blocks. And we're periodizing, we're trying to figure out when we need to be intentional, when we need to be off, when we're pushing, and all of that. But coming into this corporate world, it's kind of everybody's got this mindset. Well, it's 40 hours a week, every week, minimum. By the way, if you're in a startup, maybe double. And you got to be on, and it's on. And if you're not on, you're being lazy. You're not actually performing. And it's kind of like, no. Be very intentional about the work, weigh it up, do the right work at the right time, and rest and recover at the right time so you can be sustainable. And I'm not by any means saying don't work hard and have some grit and get into things, but it's doing it at the right way. And I kind of think about it, as athletes, I remember so many of my mates training 40 to 50 hours a week. And it was almost a bit braggish, how many hours they're training. I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm beating you and I'm doing 20 hours a week.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I look at the scoreboard and then I kind of go, well, and I had a 27-year career doing it that way. So it was a little bit of the sustainable way of approaching the physical training is a bit like the same we can bring into the corporate environment. Am I kind of getting what I'm summing it up in that way, but it's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'd kind of characterize this kind of old school approach, as hustle culture. And, this belief in hustle culture is centered around this view that, quantity always wins out and we just need to work harder for longer and that will inevitably lead to success. Whereas, the flip side of that is that, as you just described, we can work smarter. But I think one of the challenges we've got is that a sport like cycling or triathlon is highly quantifiable. And so you realize quite quickly that if you just pursue this quantity only approach, it kind of doesn't work. You just burn out and you can measure that. Whereas people kind of convince themselves that this kind of quantity focused, hustle culture orientated way of working does lead to results. And I think sometimes it does, but I think one of the challenges is we often are kind of swayed by survivorship bias. So, we kind of see the people for whom this quantity approach worked, and we assume that that was the causal factor that led to their success, when sometimes they might have actually succeeded despite, that punishing schedule, not because of it. And I think that was one of my revelations, similarly to you, it sounds, where I started to work with knowledge workers, so people in a very demanding context. And I saw this very familiar pattern of people overemphasizing quantity, sometimes at the expense of quality, and realized that they probably could learn some lessons from endurance sport, where we know that it really is about balancing this very deliberate effort with more proactive recovery, so that people can sustain high performance over the long term, and try to put that into a model that can actually help people to do that. And so, I continue to do that. And I think last time we spoke, we talked about this cognitive gears model, and there's some really interesting neuroscientific evidence actually that's starting to support that. And also just looking at some very practical tools that businesses can use to try and shift gears out of quantity towards quality, and actually often be able to achieve more in less time and be less unhelpfully stressed in the process.
And there's something about, I don't know, I want to get your thoughts on this. It's something I've been thinking about, this energy that we all have, that we're all made up of energy. And I came into the office the other day and the woman at the front desk, she just had 4 days with her siblings away on break. And the energy coming off her was just outstanding, right? She was ready to just run through walls. She was so happy to have finally, she was a bit of an older woman and had the chance to spend some time with her siblings. And I remember just thinking, look, we work so hard on talking about things like sleep, fueling, exercise, that we're missing these opportunities to celebrate relationships, socialization, even feeling useful in whatever you do. That if we can amplify that part of the world, and we all turn up to work with the kind of energy that this woman had, you start to, but it's hard to measure, to your point earlier. It's very hard to measure this energy that I'm talking about. What are your thoughts on that? I'm kind of going off track here, but it's been something that's been weighing on me, and I wanted to raise it up with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people are recognizing this, because the kind of lies or the ideas that we've been sold, we're kind of realizing that they're kind of probably necessary but not sufficient. And for example, we know that effort is important. We know that kind of looking after sleep and nutrition matters, but actually we sometimes forget the connection part. And and I see that one of the ways that we see this kind of promise is broken is that the self-improvement industry is growing relentlessly, but at the same time the data are quite clear that we're less satisfied than ever.
Yeah.
So something isn't working. These methods are falling short, and I really think that social component is probably a key part of that. One of the models that I use to kind of conceptualize this challenge is called self-determination theory. I don't know if you've come across it before, but it's one of the most enduring and extensively researched models in psychology. And I think it provides quite a helpful lens for understanding maybe where self-improvement and self-optimization has veered off course, and perhaps even how we could get back on track. And the theory proposes that humans have 3 innate and essential needs. The first is autonomy, which describes the need to feel self-directed. The second is competence, which describes the need to feel capable and effective. The third is relatedness, the need to feel connected to others. And I think that one of the problems with self-improvement is that one of the distortions is that it tells us we just need more drive. The second is that we just need more discipline. The third is we just need to keep going for longer. And all those things are true to some extent, but they can be kind of distorted and overused. But I think perhaps the most pernicious myth is that we actually need more self-focus. And self-improvement narratives often tend to kind of elevate individualism to this kind of near mythic status. So I don't know if you've come across this idea of monk mode. It's kind of a reimagining of monasticism for the startup world. And across social media, there's millions of people hashtagging monk mode. And in some ways, I get that it's just kind of pushback against hyperconnectivity, and it recognizes that time alone can be transformative. But the problem is that I think these individualistic approaches kind of recast self-improvement as a zero-sum game, where prioritizing others or investing in relationships is somehow seen as detrimental to personal progress. And actually, the evidence couldn't be further from that. And it's so clear that we thrive on connection. And it's not just about connection for our sake, or kind of connection just in terms of having good friendships, for example. The evidence is really clear that giving, investing,
Yes.
be even self-sacrificial, can actually have a huge positive impact. There's this really fascinating series of studies, and it found that that feeling of making a positive impact on others is actually a really significant predictor of well-being. And the interesting link in that is that there's this link between pro-social behavior, which is basically describes when we make actions which are intended to benefit other people. And it seems that these benefits and this link between pro-social behavior and well-being is actually driven by an increased sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So basically, in other words, helping other people actually boosts our own well-being by meeting these fundamental psychological needs rather than somehow taking away from it. And it kind of shows that at a very fundamental level, humans are hardwired not only for connection, but also to give, to be sometimes to serve others, to actually give of ourselves and not just try and kind of self-obsess and self-focus in this pursuit of self-improvement. So, it shouldn't come as a surprise. We're inherently social beings. We kind of have, we thrive in community. We have done for millennia. And we see that relatedness predicts all kinds of positive outcomes. But, I think the problem is that sometimes self-improvement has kind of forced this false choice between self and others, when actually real transformation never happens in isolation. So they're some of my thoughts on that. But a lot of it's driven by this self-determination theory that it's been around for a long time now.
You are amazing. You basically put everything that I've been trying to say myself, but you did it so much better. But I keep saying in the company that I'm in, and even on this show, people have heard me say, I very much believe in health starting above the shoulders and then we go down. Whereas if we listen to everybody out there preaching about exercising and fueling and sleep and all these things, which I agree we need to still be aware of, but I actually believe in the above the shoulders mentality, where if you can be feeling useful, if you can do something for the world, if you have the social relationship, start prioritizing these like we prioritize our sleep, like we prioritize our food and everything else. If we can start actually prioritizing those. And I had a friend of mine in Australia who's getting right into the longevity space, and he called me up and he said, Greg, all we got to do is get people eating whole foods and working out. I said, well,
that'd be wonderful,
but
wouldn't
mate, that's a fairly large hurdle for a lot of people. Forgetting about the costs and the prices of trying to eat whole foods and all sorts of things, it's still a big, big hurdle. I said, you know what I think we should start with is the social relationships, feeling useful and being kind. And now I said, imagine starting where you say to somebody, you're on your health journey. For the first 2 weeks, you have to say hello to 3 people first in the morning. That's it. Let's lower this bar that you can step right over. And then on the next 2 weeks, we'll say, try and do one kind thing. That can be opening a door for somebody, whatever it is, one kind thing a day for 2 weeks. See if you can do it. That's the next challenge. So these are all outward focusing. They're about the connection, but they're being useful, feeling like you're outside of yourself, rather than, like you mentioned, all these self-improvement, self-type. They're becoming so much about the individual. We're actually getting lonelier. Mental health is, on the rise. It's like, but we keep talking about self. We keep talking about the individualism. It's like,
yeah, 100%.
We got to be bigger than that. And I know that's part of what you talk about is the collective gain when we're talking about self-improvement. Have you, is that sort of a part of one of your talks that you bring into companies as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, people are really talking about this loneliness challenge, which you just alluded to. And it does seem that businesses are increasingly interested in this because they recognize that in the shift to remote and hybrid working, which many workplaces have adopted, nearly 3/4 of workers, particularly those who are under the age of 35, feel like they're growing more distant from colleagues. And actually more than 80% are worried about loneliness associated with long-term remote working. you've also got this crazy statistic that 1 in 10 people say that they've got no close friends, which is just shocking, really. And overall, it seems like adult loneliness has risen steadily for the last 50 years. So we've got this paradox again, this other tension that we're more connected digitally than ever, but at the same time, we're lonelier than we ever have been. And businesses are interested in this because obviously there's a health issue associated with this. And so, we've got all these kind of what I call over optimizers obsessing about their kind of supplements and whatever. But loneliness and social isolation increase the risk of premature death by 29%.
Wow. What study is that one? I need to read
Yeah,
that.
so I'll dig it out for you, but I wrote a little piece about it recently, and so I've got I've got the reference kind of pretty easily to hand for you. But yeah, and there's some crazy stats about loneliness. So for example, adults who feel lonely are more than twice as likely to develop depression compared to those who never experience loneliness.
Yeah.
And you can find that stat, I think, was in this Surgeon General's report that was written last year in the US. So you've got all these kind of longevity researchers and longevity enthusiasts kind of selling all these kind of esoteric supplement stacks. And there's people sitting on their own in their apartments, kind of popping pills, hoping that it's somehow going to extend their life. And probably the very best thing that they could do would be to get out and connect with some people.
Isn't it fascinating?
So,
I got to add one thing on this. Can I just interrupt?
Go for it.
Because you got me thinking about one thing. So I don't drink often, right? I'm not a big, but and I got my wearables, my Aura and Garmin and Whoops and everything. And so I had a drink the other night. It was tequila, lovely, by the way. And I had a really good fun night. And I didn't drink much, but it was nice. And I knew my HRV was going to be low. And I was thinking about it when I woke up in the morning. Wouldn't it be great if a wearable company, a wearable product, AI coach, whatever it is, said, Greg, it looks like your HRV and your readiness scores and your sleep scores are all a bit whacked. But boy, it looks like your social connection and your relationships really took it to another level last night. And I think that was important for you to balance out. That was an important investment in you. Not that you have to drink to be social. I'm not saying that, but the cost benefit for me, outweighed, the negative side of it. And I was like, wow, that's kind of a good way to look at it. Like if you can be intentional about what you're doing, it works out. I don't know.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I totally agree. It's down to this, again, we've known that this sense of autonomy, this sense of competence, this sense of relatedness is kind of absolutely critical for human thriving over the long term, physiologically, psychologically, socially, in terms of the effect that we have as a collective. And one of my challenges in this high performance space is what I'd describe as this kind of high performance puritanism. And, it's like, and so it's become a kind of a religion, and there's these kind of tenets that you have to follow. And actually, if you don't follow them, you're almost a kind of a heretic. And if you call out some of the protocols, then it is like heresy. And so, you can talk about all this kind of social connection, the importance of relatedness, and people kind of like that. But it doesn't get a huge amount of engagement. But some of the kind of content that I've created that has got the most engagement of anything that I've ever done is when I've called out cold plunging in the morning, for example. And you're just not allowed because the priests of human high performance say cold plunging is a good thing, and you can't speak against them. But it's all part of this kind of what I call this puritanism, this idea that you've got to start the day with this kind of rigid routine. There's lots of neuroscientific explanations that they'll use to try and convince you. But most of them, again, it's highly individualistic. It's quite rigid. It's very puritanical in the sense of, if you suggested that you might drink some alcohol with some friends, it's like, again, you're a kind of metaphorical kind of sinner in the high performance world. And you need to go and do some penance. I don't know, I don't know what you have to do. You probably have to do some kind of cold and sauna kind of contrast therapy for 3 hours and drink a kale shake or something. But it kind of irritates me because I don't actually believe that it's how we're meant to live as human beings. And
you hear people like Brian Johnson, spending $2 million a year on, Brian Johnson, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I don't know him personally, so I'm not judging. And but I immediately think, without even knowing him, but I'm like, $2 million a year to try and test. I'm like, but is he having any fun? Like, is he having any social time? And if he is, great. Then I do think he's going to have a long, great life. But I was like, does he have kids? Like, because that's where the stress really starts. I'm kind of, it's one thing to get preached at by someone who's going through the trauma of having kids, the stress. It's another when people don't have any kids and they're trying to tell you how to live. Sometimes I'm like, man, if only you knew the stress of this, the love and the stress of children.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Exactly, right? And I'm kind of like, I feel like we get preached at by people that don't have the kids. I'm like, children for me was the biggest eye-opener. And I don't mean to single out people that don't have children. I'm just saying personally, my own personal experience, it forced me to really grow up and realize I have to put somebody else before me. It's like, it's definitely these things, they can't live on their own. So I've got to actually, with my wife, we've got to connect together and mate, it's a stressful business, this raising children.
Totally. And I think it kind of beats the perfectionism out of you, I found. Because, and this is kind of my issue is that, and again, you were an incredibly high level athlete. I tried my best to be a good athlete. And, but we both know that, that particularly in endurance sport, there's this kind of tendency towards perfectionism. And it's kind of the dark side of passion sometimes. And I think that, one of the problems is that, again, this kind of high performance culture, it gets expressed in an unhelpful way and ends up reinforcing different types of perfectionism. And I think there's some interesting data about what's called socially prescribed perfectionism. And so that's the belief that other people expect us to be flawless. And there's a guy called Tim Curran who's done some great research on this, and that's where that starts from. And he looked at kind of changing rates of perfectionism over the last 35 years. And so he found that this belief that others expect us to be flawless has surged by about 33%. Wow. But also there's been a 10% increase in this self-orientated perfectionism, where we impose excessively high standards on ourselves. And so the challenge with that is that we're kind of reinforcing a lot of this other-orientated and self-orientated perfectionism with these influencers who are kind of telling us that unless you've got this kind of 10-step morning routine, then somehow you're not going to fully optimize and actualize as a human being. And again, maybe some people have got a life that's consistent enough to be able to do that, but most people fall into that triangular relapse pattern, which I described before. So they start off and things are fine, and they've got this kind of massive amount of enthusiasm, but then soon enough they fall into this maintenance phase. That initial enthusiasm encounters the rigidity, that rigid kind of routine encounters the unpredictability of life. They fall into this setback. It becomes exhausting. They return to old habits, and then they kind of quit for a while before they start again. And so what I don't see is people necessarily talking about how true high performance and sustainable high performance is actually flexible. And these rigid routines, I actually believe that rather than fostering kind of true performance, they actually reinforce fragility, because they only work when nothing else happens, nothing messes up. It also doesn't leave any space to serve anyone else, because it's like, well, no, I'm sorry, I can't go out to dinner tonight because I need to do my infrared sauna and my kind of soft tissue routine. And now we can't do brunch because, that kind of, the seed oils there. So, if I do, I'm just going to fast. And what I don't hear people talking about is kind of, how can you practice some self-compassion? How can you practice some service? But also, there's this notion of self-compassion, and it actually has three components. One is self-kindness. So that's basically treating yourself with the same kindness you'd extend to a friend, swapping criticism for support of yourself in this case. Then there's this notion of common humanity in self-compassion. And basically, this is a reminder that suffering and struggle are universal. When things go wrong, it's not just us. Everyone faces challenges. And then the third one is actually mindfulness. It doesn't necessarily mean kind of, sitting in the lotus position and, in a kind of somewhere in the East. It's actually just simply about taking a non-judgmental look at our emotions and observing our emotions with curiosity, freeing ourselves from that pressure of needing to have all the answers. And the evidence is pretty clear that kind of self-compassion acts as a kind of psychological shock absorber. So when we hit those inevitable bumps of failure, those feelings of inadequacy because we decided we wanted a hot shower, not a cold shower, and the influencers are going to tell us we're a bad person, then that self-compassion means we don't crash quite so hard, and we don't kind of fall into that kind of negative spiral that the triangular relapse pattern again. And it's funny because I get invited to speak all over the place, and I do kind of workshops and keynotes, and have a lot of one-on-one conversations with people. And when we talk about high performance, people think I'm going to be saying, go and get an IV drip, take this supplement in the morning,
have some grit, fire up.
Make sure you're getting bright light within the first 15 minutes of the day. And even though that's a good thing, what we actually end up talking about is, have you got many friends? When was the last time that you called someone that you care about and cares about you? What does that social environment look like? And also, it's questions like, what happens when things go wrong? What happens when you can't get to the gym? When your workout routine is broken? When you get injured? Because it's people's response to that, in my view, that really shows whether someone is a true, sustainably high performer, not whether they can do some kind of crazy ritual at the beginning of the day before they go into this super optimized routine. Because it's that flexibility that actually I think cultivates real success. And by that, I mean, it can be business success, but actually it's success where someone gets to the end of their life and actually they say, I loved well. I made a positive impact on people on this planet and those around me. And it's interesting because if you look at some of the research on self-control, there's this really interesting body of research that talks about how actually kind of self-control kind of has a dark side. And again, we like to think about self-control as a good thing, and it's absolutely true. Self-control is really, really important. But actually, some of the research that has actually indicated that people who have the very highest self-control sometimes at the end of their life actually express some regret about how that self-control made them perhaps compromise in ways that in hindsight they wish they hadn't. So, I get this. I'm speaking to myself here. I'm someone. I'm writing a book at the moment, and I've made some massive sacrifices, not seeing kind of family and missing meals and all this kind of stuff. And in many ways, I wrote this book because all the stuff that I'm talking about, I kind of say all these bad people are doing these things. I kind of struggle with that stuff myself. But one of these challenges, one of the things that really hits me is that people with very high self-control, if we overuse it, we can end up driving ourselves in an unhealthy way, and in a way that maybe, we might end up regretting down the line. And so all this kind of optimization stuff that really kind of celebrates super high self-control, sometimes I think we just need a bit of a sense check to make sure that we're not accidentally overusing that, because there's a risk there that it can end up isolating us, that it can end up meaning that we end up compromising perhaps the things that really matter most, not just the things that we find we're driven towards achieving. So got a little bit deep and philosophical there.
No, you're kidding me. I love these conversations, and it gets me thinking about, like you said, we all bring it back to ourselves. Everybody listening right now, we're all sort of thinking about that on our own selves. And I think back both as an athlete and also now as a father and working, a couple of jobs and blah, 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 blah. And you start to go, for me, I've always put my head around it. And the way I talk with Laura is like, okay, this is a push phase. Okay. And just like we did in sport, we go, okay, we're going to commit to this self-control, this intentional behavior in this one area where it might be a little bit stronger for now. Is there a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel? Am I still focused on when I'm with my family, when I'm with my friends, being present? It's been a goal of mine. I set the goal of 2024 to connect with mates more, and I put them on my calendar where we would chat for 1 hour, and I just there's no agenda, but we're going to jump on a call and chat. Obviously I've got the podcast, which is nice. I get to have these conversations with you and others, which is really wonderful. But I kind of love the gist of what you've been saying in the sense of be good to yourself and lower the expectation a fraction. Because sometimes I feel like we are so hard on ourselves. Like I'm visualizing my training I'm doing at the moment. I had all these grand goal to run a decent 5K at the end of the year, and then the Achilles gets sore, and so you got to redo the goals and start doing chin-up bars and whatever else. But it's kind of like this idea of going, okay, The goal didn't happen. You do the best. And I love the idea. I think it was either you or our mutual friend, Dr. Tommy Wood, who said it on this show. It's like, let's remove words like optimal and maximal and just
Yeah,
replace it with trying to be a little bit better. If you want to, like, it's like, just be a little bit better. And I love that behavioral science mentality because it just lowers that expectation bar, right?
totally. Absolutely. And
Mm.
it's interesting. I mean, I start to see kind of a little bit of a pushback against it, against the kind of the over optimization. And I don't know, did you ever come across someone called Marie Kondo, the queen of decluttering and minimalism?
No.
So, well, she kind of was super famous for, and she still is, but basically she wrote this whole kind of book and had this whole brand all about decluttering and minimalism. And basically her whole kind of life and personal brand and business was about removing anything from your life that doesn't bring you joy and talking about material things. And so she was famous for having this kind of super minimalist, like perfect home. And there was TV shows and there was books, and it was kind of,
Where
really
have you been, Greg?
inspired a lot of people. Yeah. So basically, Marie Kondo, and essentially all based on this idea that a perfectly ordered environment sparks joy and fosters a well-organized life. However, she had kids. She went and had kids, and she found it was basically impossible,
of course,
to maintain this kind of famously pristine home. And this rigid system that once kind of provided this source of calm became a source of stress. And in the end, she admits that she just gave up on constant tidying so that she could spend more time being present with her family. And the great thing about kind of Marie Kondo is that while some people, you could tell they kind of wrote about this with like a bit of a sense of glee, because someone kind of changed their tune. But to be fair to her, I felt that she was really authentic in kind of just being honest about this. And actually, in my view, her kind of adaptability and flexibility, even though she risked disappointing her followers, was really admirable. So, and I think this is the challenge, I think, for many of us. It's where sometimes, these routines which are supposed to bring us a sense of calm and control actually end up making us feel more out of control and be a source of stress. So really, I'm so much in favor of trying to cultivate this healthy flexibility, just like in that example that you gave where perhaps the 5K kind of time has to become looking at, I'm just going to try and do some pull-ups regularly and let myself heal.
Yeah.
Because, we, for all the David Goggins of this world who are kind of just telling you, just push yourself, just crush it every day and kind of get away with it. Again, it's survivorship bias. There's tons of other people who've ended up burned out physically, psychologically, injured, who just can't get back in the game again. And so, and I think the challenge is it's like this goes in the face of a lot of what people like to promote in high performance. But I think a lot of what we see in the media in terms of high performance is what I describe as high performance cosplay. So, cosplay is this idea of like dressing up, and, so people like dress up as superheroes and they do all this kind of stuff, and there's conventions and whatever. Like if you don't know what cosplay is, you can find it online. But essentially, the reason I call it high performance cosplay is that people have got this idea of what the costume of high performance looks like, and they think that's high performance. So, the costume of high performance often looks like what celebrity high performers and athletes promote. And so, it becomes the wearables and the supplements and the kind of recovery products and the protocols. And I'm not saying that like any of that is actually a bad thing, but it is just the costume. It's not what's really underneath, what's really driving, what's really helping people to be a superhero. And to be a real superhero, as you said, it's really about what's going on neck up. It's about, can you bounce back? But also sometimes bouncing back is about recognizing that, today might be a day to stay on the sofa. Because actually, if you go big or go home every day, before you realize it, you'll probably be spending more time than you think at home. And, and I think if you look at kind of athletes, and there's some great data on kind of athletes training leading up to events, and consistently, the athletes with the best results end up being the ones who were able to train most consistently because they were injured the least. And so, as a world-class athlete, that we think, the media loves to promote this idea that it's like pushing to the limit every day, crushing it. But actually, often it's about the wisdom to know, what, there's a little twinge here. I'm just going to back off and I'm going to back off and rest. And even though it really kills me metaphorically, because I just want to be out there, I just want to be pushing, actually, I'm going to back off. I'm going to let myself heal. And over the long term, I know this is going to be the right thing. And I think there's a lesson there, kind of psychologically for us in the workplace, as much as there is kind of in a sporting context. But I'm not saying that people should be too soft on themselves, because obviously there is a time to push. But actually, there's got to be a counterbalance. We've got to be able to move between, just as you said, Greg, recognizing when is this a push time? When is this a recovery time?
Yep.
Rather than this kind of this theatre, this high performance cosplay and this kind of peak performance theatre where it's all about 100% crush it every day, all the time,
100%.
which actually is just a complete myth and probably quite harmful for most people.
There's almost like a celebrating the times where you feel like just being lazy and allowing yourself to own that, and don't, even as I say it, it sounds like a real negative, but what I'm meaning is, like, some days your body's just going to say, and maybe even for quite a while, there's periods where you just want to be on the couch and you just, I just need to be here, and it's okay. Like, you will come out of it. And I've talked about on this show a little bit, like, often when we feel like we're down and out, when things aren't moving our way, it's often where the great things start to flourish. It's like it's often when we're kind of in these bad times or not feeling good about ourselves. There's good things still to come. And the amount of people I've had on this show that have become world-class in whatever they've done, and the amount of times I've heard, oh yeah, when this happened to me, I was down and out, blah, 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 blah. But that's where this new idea or this new approach came from. And it's like, wow, if there's one big takeaway from doing this show for the last 6 years, is the amount of world-class people that have had these moments where, they had a form of cancer, they had a massive injury. Last week's episode, he had cancer at 18, and boom, he's flourished and is really going. And he's like, oh, what a gift it was, right? And it's like, at that time he was in it, it was like life was over. It was the worst thing ever. And I've heard it, even Joel Friel. I don't know if you know Joel, who's
he's a legend,
CEO,
isn't he?
He's CEO and founder of Training Peaks. And I don't know if he's CEO anymore. His son might be. But he said, Greg, I just wanted to be an athlete, and he said, but, he got really injured, and then he started coaching, and then, he was at this time and the internet came around and Training Peaks started, he said, because I was just writing training programs. He said, had I not been injured, I wouldn't have had this amazing journey. And we spent most of the conversation in that one, not talking about Training Peaks or training, but just talking about the importance of understanding that when we're down, it's not over. That actually could be the time we're putting down we're putting the seed in the ground and we're about to flourish. So
Definitely.
very cool. And there's also another bit that I want to talk on, and it's like this above the shoulders mindset of understanding why you're doing something and keep coming back to that why. It for me as an athlete, the why was, you wanted to try and be the greatest in the world at something, right? Whatever that issue was that I had as a teenager, whatever, but I just wanted to try and disprove people, whatever it was. There was always this inner why that I wanted to try and do something really amazing. And now I'm in the corporate space and I can see it with the team we have. And it's kind of like, I just want to get these guys excited about what we're doing. And if it's not the journey for them, don't be here, because my why is I want to build a health company that'll allow me to live long, die short. And I don't want my kids to have to look after me when I'm on my sick bed for a long period of time. That's my why. I want to build the ultimate platform for everybody in the world to use, because I want to live long and die short. And I've got young children that I don't want when they're in their 20s and 30s having to look after old dad. So I'm driven by that, and I have to be reminded by that. I think there's an element of people asking themselves why they're doing things in the first place that'll help you keep going.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it reminds me, there's a lot of this research around kind of self-determination theory, this sense of autonomy, competence, relatedness. It also is very strongly connected with our sense of values, what really matters to us. And it's the evidence is really strong, really consistent that acting in a way which is aligned with our values really promotes human thriving. And by that, I mean, we're not just well, kind of psychologically, physically, we're also effective, we're productive, we perform at a high level. And that really connects with our sense of identity, who we are, how we see ourselves. And, I don't know, have you come across this idea of character strengths before, or the character strengths framework? And, there's this great body of research around character strengths, and you might be familiar with it, but for your listeners, essentially, this framework is built around 24 character strengths, which are kind of organized in these 6 virtues. But you've got things like creativity, curiosity, bravery, perseverance, love, kindness, teamwork, fairness, forgiveness, humility, appreciation of beauty, even hope, humor. But anyway, there's more. There's 24. Can't remember them all. But essentially, the notion of character strengths is that if we can find ways to regularly express these strengths in our work and in our life, then we're going to thrive. We're going to be fulfilled. We're going to do some of our best work. But the interesting thing is that we can kind of overuse or underuse those character strengths. And in fact, sometimes what looks like our biggest weakness is actually an overuse or an underuse of those strengths. So, for example, one of my top character strengths is curiosity, which is unsurprising to anyone who knows me. But if I overuse that curiosity character strength, then I basically don't get anything done. I just keep on going down lots of different rabbit holes, pursuing all kinds of different ideas. If I underuse that strength, I'm really missing out on the opportunity often to explore new ideas, to gather more information, to look at different perspectives. And you can kind of look, there's a whole kind of typology where you can look at your character strengths and how they're overused and underused. And, you mentioned like your role as a leader and what you're trying to build with your team and that kind of vision and that mission that you have. One of the things I often encourage people to do in organizations is kind of do that character strengths inventory. There's actually a free survey that you can do and look at ways that they're able to express their unique character strengths. And actually, even though there's 24, you can actually find your signature strengths, which is the small group of character strengths that are expressed most strongly in you or that you express most strongly. And there's all kinds of exercises you can do around this. But the sweet spot is sometimes called the golden mean. And finding ways to do things like strength spotting, where you observe how you can use those strengths in your role, also where other people might use it in their roles too. Finding ways to become more aware of your strengths. Also, something called the tempering effect, which is where if you feel like you've got a tendency to overuse a strength, you can find a balancing strength to kind of moderate it. So, for example, I have to try and regulate my curiosity with self-regulation, which is actually kind of another character strength. There's also this idea of something called the towing effect, where you can kind of use your top strengths to kind of bolster the underused ones. But if we do this, then ideally what we're doing is finding a way for our sense of identity, our values, our why fundamentally, what is really driving us. That kind of love of learning is a big one for me. For other people, it might be kind of, just gratitude might be a big part of who they are. But if we can find ways to kind of live and work in alignment with that individually, but also as teams, then I think we can really unlock some kind of true performance superpowers.
I love that.
And so, it's kind of like an orchestra playing together, ideally in perfect harmony.
I always say we should be playing to our strengths and mitigating our weaknesses. And
totally.
Are the character strengths you're talking about a bit like I did the Clifton strengths? I think there's 34 in that one.
Exactly. It's a very similar body of research. And the nice thing about the kind of character strengths model with those 24 is that it was based on kind of them identifying these strengths and virtues that are actually entirely cross-cultural, but also enduring kind of through human history. So I find that it's just a really helpful tool, particularly because I work quite a lot internationally. So everyone can connect with it. But all models are wrong. Some are useful. And I find this model kind of useful. It's going to be wrong. There's all kinds of other strengths ones that other people find more useful, but they're all probably equally wrong in some ways. So I'm not tied to it, but I found it's a good one for.
I found a really good way to do this is Laura and I did it about 7 years ago. We started doing this maybe 8 years ago when I first started doing some work with Hints of Performance, where you and I have both worked and spent some time together. And I just came home and I remember saying to Laura, let's just sit down and tell each other our strengths, just directly with each other. It's very easy to tell each other what we're not good at, but let's sit down. And I remember one of the big takeaways from that for me was she said, Greg, you enjoy conversation, and pointed out a few things. Said you could be a better listener. I love strengths people. But anyway, and that's how this podcast actually started. There's two parts. One, I enjoy a conversation, and I enjoy, like you, I'm curious and learning, and that kind of a mindset. But I also did it because I wanted to become a better listener. Which
That's great.
as I interrupt you every now and then, it's like, I've got so much I want to add. And so it's been a really great process for me. But one of the things I encourage people to do is with whoever your loved ones, whoever's close, or a mate, whatever it is, just sit down and point out 5 to 10 strengths in the other person. And I tell you, it'll bring you closer for one, but also you'll learn about yourself that you didn't even realize other people were seeing. Like sometimes I think the view we have on ourselves is one way, and then people see us another. And I think that's even if you're not doing one of these character strengths or Clifton strengths or whatever it is, just spending time to say, hey, you're really good at this XYZ. It's a powerful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is some really interesting research behind it, incidentally. Not that you necessarily need the research to kind of back up if you've had a good experience with it, but it does relate to that thing that I mentioned earlier called strength spotting. And also it kind of, the other concept that they relate to this is something called strengths fluency. Mm-hmm. So as we start to pay more conscious attention to how both we and other people use our strengths in different situations, we kind of get into the habit of noting how people are using these strengths, where it's maybe overused, underused, where they're in that kind of golden mean, in that sweet spot. And it can be really helpful. It boosts social intelligence. It can help teams to collaborate more effectively. It can really improve relationships. So it's brilliant to hear that you kind of intuitively just went through that process. It's something that you integrated. And I totally agree that it's a really powerful practice, kind of sharing what strengths you see in other people. And I think it's quite a fun thing to do as well, ideally.
It is fun. Yeah, I do it with my kids now.
That's brilliant.
They're 4 and 6, but we point out each other's strengths, and it's a bit of fun. I want to talk about an area an idea that you've been presenting, which is called majoring in the minors. Firstly, what does this mean, majoring in the minors? And then, we can go into what it's about.
Yeah, so majoring the minors is basically just my way of summing up some of the things that we talked about related to this kind of high performance theatre or this high performance cosplay, which is
high performance theatre.
Yeah,
I love it.
Which is that basically people kind of obsess about these kind of what has been sometimes called marginal gains and completely lose sight of the basics. And so, you've got people who are kind of, obsessing about kind of neuroscientific explanations and kind of pathways explaining why a cold plunge is a good idea. But then, they're not connected. Their sleep times are inconsistent. They've got too much unmanaged stress. So the big blocks are not there, but they're obsessing about these minor details. And often they're kind of, they hope that some type of supplement is going to fix them when, they're not kind of just eating kind of natural unprocessed food. And it kind of relates to this other kind of notion as well called precision bias. It's a cognitive bias. And basically, precision bias, we've all got to some extent a precision bias as humans. But essentially, it's the assumption that precision implies accuracy. And so for whatever reason, we as humans tend to assume that very specific figures reflect careful measurement and reliable research, when unfortunately, quite often, particularly in this kind of high performance domain, it's used to obscure uncertainties or even errors in the data. And the other thing that's often used is this kind of false precision, which makes even arbitrary or unverified data points seem more credible, because that specificity lends an appearance of authority. And people use this to kind of get people to major in the minors because they make these minor things seem like a really big deal. And so, I'll give you a practical example of this, and because I've mentioned kind of cold plunging, and I'm not actually against cold plunging in any way. I worked in Finland for quite a few years. You mentioned Hintsa. I've enjoyed many a cold plunge outside, ideally followed by a sauna.
Yes,
but loads of people are basically reproducing this stat, which is, cold water immersion increases brain dopamine by 250% and is supported by multiple peer-reviewed studies. Well, that is precision bias, like to a T in many ways. And it also combines it with something, this acronym SANE, which stands for the seductive allure of neuroscientific explanations. And if you just humor me for a minute, I'll kind of just explain why this is. But essentially, dopamine acts as both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. And everyone's obsessed about talking about dopamine at the moment. And in the brain, dopamine does play this key role in motivation, mood, movement, cognition. But the interesting thing is that 250% figure that everyone keeps quoting about ice baths and online, actually that study referred to an increase in plasma dopamine that circulates in the body. In their study, they measured plasma dopamine, not brain dopamine. So in the body, dopamine primarily acts as a hormone, not a neurotransmitter because it's not in the brain. And in the body, it drives physiological responses like increased urine production and shivering, rather than directly impacting mood or driving motivation as it does in the brain. Now, funnily enough, the people who quote the 250% increase in brain dopamine don't report the finding from the study that there was a 163% increase in urine output. It's just not as sexy as it to say that. Mm-hmm. And cold water immersion maybe raises brain dopamine levels, but it's far from unique in that ability. Physical stresses, psychological stresses, uncomfortable conversations activates the brain's dopamine circuits, triggers this immediate change in neural function. So, if boosting dopamine is the goal, I don't necessarily think it should be, but assume that it is, a quick run up the stairs might be just as effective, with the advantage that you don't need to get wet. And these people saying ice baths increase dopamine more than any other activity, there's no comparative studies. So that assertion is unverifiable. And even if it was true, this fixation on dopamine is probably misguided, because in otherwise healthy people, it's kind of uncertain and improbable that pushing dopamine above its kind of tightly regulated baseline is going to be particularly helpful. So, I could go on and on and on. There's all kinds of counter evidence. But my point is because of this precision bias, they take advantage of the fact that we don't look into the data. We don't actually look into the research around this, because when we see these kind of very specific figures, we assume that precision implies accuracy. And it can make these data points seem really credible, authoritative without looking deeper. And so you've got kind of the whole generation of people now kind of obsessing about jumping in an ice bath in the morning, a minor, in my view, when actually they could probably use the time much more effectively by doing a short exercise session, which is going to boost dopamine, other neurotransmitters, and have a whole host of other benefits as well.
Mate, but this is music to my ears. I can't tell you how good this is to hear. And I'm sure you're not making a lot of friends, but I keep saying to Laura, you look at Instagram Reels or TikTok from some key influencer in the, hey, do this, do whatever, 3 times 20 minutes of sauna every day, do that. And I'll hop in the sauna at the local gym every now and then. And, everybody's quoting the same influencer. I'm like, how many people look past the first layer? What I mean by the first layer is there's one influencer on TikTok or on Instagram or wherever they're preaching from, and everybody just takes it as gospel. Nobody goes to the second, third layer, starts to dive right into the research, and it's just everybody just does it.
Totally.
And a side part to going back to the cold plunging, and I know you're just referencing it as an example, but I go to the ice bath. I do it a little bit, and sometimes I do feel more alert, a little bit, jazzed, feel a little bit awake and everything else. If I do it too often, though, it starts to lose its, the body just goes, yeah, whatever. And the amount of people that are like, well, how many minutes are you doing? Whatever you do. I'm like,
what's your protocol?
I'm an N+1. I tell them all. I said, we're all N+1s, which basically means, look, I'm my own little test subject. I'm completely different to all of you. And I said, I love going back to ancestral health. I said, look, I'll be sitting in the sauna with a couple of lads, and some of them are monster guys, huge. I said, look, let's go back ancestral health, and let's think about we're hunting this woolly mammoth. I said, you there, you be up front, mate. You're 6'4", you're a monster. You got the spear in your hand. Boom. And I said, you over there, you're 5'4", and you're built like a muscly guy. We're gonna catapult you onto the back of the woolly mammoth. You're gonna be stabbing it from above. And I said, me, look, I'm reasonably strong. I've got some endurance. I'm going to be the guy, once we've chopped the bits of meat off it, I got to run it back to the village before it goes bad. So I'm strong enough to carry the meat, and I've got an endurance compete. My point is, understand who you are as an individual, the way we train, the way we eat, the way we sleep, everything about us, we are our own N+1. So figure yourself out, whether you want to use the ancestral health example or not, I don't care. But understand what makes you tick. And I think that's where some of these tools can be helpful. Some of the wearables, use them for a little bit if you want to use it as a tool, get an idea who you are. It doesn't have to be a forever thing. But honestly, the more you can understand you, what makes you tick, both your whys and, above the shoulders to also below the shoulders, and then just try things out and see what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And do it in a kind of considered way rather than
Yeah,
just doing what the influencer tells you.
exactly.
And
Yes.
there's this really interesting phenomena called kind of expectancy bias, and actually it influences the placebo effect. So if you believe that something's going to have a positive effect, it probably will.
Yeah.
But my kind of challenge is that so many of these messages are so conflicted in terms of the commercial aims behind promoting some of these protocols and supplements and whatever. And so rather than it necessarily people seeing these things as a kind of a menu of options they can choose from, there's this sense kind of inferred. And even though they kind of say, oh, try it, see if it works for you, it's kind of like the subtext is, but if you don't, you're not really a high performer.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what gets me. And it's the kind of thing, this is what gets me about the kind of the cold plunging, is that by all means include cold plunging in your kind of menu of possibilities. But increasingly it's like, there's someone else, who's like, I don't know a loser who gets up at 5 a.m. and works out. And it's like, well, that's a really cool Instagram headline, right? But it completely ignores the fact that there can be up to a 2.5 hour difference in our chronotype in terms of our circadian rhythm, our tendency towards morningness or eveningness. So you getting up at 5 a.m. might be equivalent to someone else getting up at 7:30 in terms of their chronotype. So while you're kind of saying how great you are and other people are for getting up at 5 a.m., we've got no idea how that actually works for them at an N=1 level because we don't know what their chronotype is. They might just be an extreme early type. So, again, and there's all this kind of, frankly, BS about, oh, you can change your tendency towards morningness or eveningness. Well, you kind of can't. You can basically pretend you're in a different time zone by kind of consistently reinforcing it, but you can't change that underlying physiology, that tendency towards morningness or eveningness, that chronotype. The majority of it is actually genetically governed at a cellular level. Right. So there's a whole conversation to be had around chronotype there. But for me, that's just a really physiologically, biologically grounded example of why, as you said, we're all different. And actually, the idea of the fully optimized morning routine that starts at 5 and, you leap out of bed, and even this idea that like hitting snooze is the cardinal sin of self-improvement, proof somehow that we're not worthy, is, and of course, head directly into morning sunlight, relocate to the west coast of North America if necessary. Don't get me started on all this rubbish about avoiding morning coffee for 90 to 120 minutes, because that delay caffeine thing is another example of precision bias, and the seductive allure of neuroscientific explanations is complete nonsense. But anyway, my point being that all these people who say, this is the way, completely overlook this huge amount of individual difference. But at the same time, even though we've got all this individual difference, it really does come down to some pretty basic stuff. Sense of autonomy, being self-directed, sense of competence, feeling able to influence our environment, and be able to have a kind of level of mastery in terms of what we're doing, and this sense of relatedness, being connected with others. And if we do that, and obviously around it we've got the importance of good nutrition. I'm a big fan of Michael Pollan, and basically eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. Sleeping adequately and consistently, recovering well, moving regularly, thinking about our mindset in terms of being, expressing some self-compassion and also some service to others. If we kind of do that stuff and kind of within those spheres figure out the kind of nuances that fit, how we want to live, what's aligned with our values, how practical we can live because of the limitations and, just the inevitable restrictions that are associated with life, we're going to be fine. We're going to do okay.
And at the end of the day, mate, we're just dust in the wind. Sometimes I just come back to going, we don't need to overcomplicate all this. I love that you touched on the sleep thing. I used to say at my last company, any question, we were all pretty much remote workers. And I said, look, I am somebody that just innately gets up early in the morning. I wake up early. It feels easy for me. Don't you worry. If you're the person that works really great from 9 to 11 at night, just work when you're most productive. I don't care. And that's that's one of the good things about remote work. I actually, I'm enjoying actually not being remote working at this company that I'm in now and being around people and walking down the hallway and having quick 2-minute meetings and all sorts of things. I actually enjoy being in office. But one of the perks of remote work was, somebody will send me a whole bunch of work, that they did between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. And I'll wake up at 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. and go through it. And we all worked when we felt most productive. So but I never want anybody to feel that they have to be a 4 a.m. person. It's just like, no, that's the time. I like going to bed at 8 and getting up at 3 or 4. It feels great. But it has nothing to do with anything like you were talking about. It has nothing to do with me being better or whatever. I agree with that. That's great. Really great.
Yeah. Have you heard of chronotype bias?
I haven't heard of chronotype bias. I've actually jotted that down because you mentioned chronotype bias, and I was like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, it's so basically when they've researched this, they find that supervisors give better ratings to employees who turn up early, regardless of whether they're any more productive. And so, we've just got this innate kind of bias where we kind of favor early types, and there's probably some kind of reason for that in terms of our kind of some anthropological reason perhaps, and we've got this kind of obsession with early rising probably for good reasons. But I think I totally agree with you that there's no best way to start the day.
Have you seen that one on Instagram which has the guy at his walking treadmill, and he's talking about how he's the he's exactly like talking about everything we've been talking about the last hour. I do all of these things right. I'm the fittest guy in the office. I've had lunch and look at me burn my calories right now, and I'm moving and I'm going. And then they're talking about his actual productivity at work. That he's actually not doing any work. He's just doing all the
just optimizing
stuff. He's just optimizing everywhere else. So like, yeah, but he hasn't actually handed anything in. He's not contributing to what we're doing at all.
Brilliant.
And it's true. I think we all get hung up on thinking we need to do all of these other things. And it's like, no, do the best you can. That's my whole thing. Try and be better. Some days are going to be worse than others. You might feel like you're 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I always think of myself like the stock market. I'm heading in the right direction, but for the most part, I could be declining in a couple of days by 20% and then go back up again over the next 4 months. And
absolutely. I think that's such a powerful metaphor because, it does encourage us to focus on that progress over perfection, which I think is like a very deeply held principle for me. And it sounds like similar for you too. But also, I think there's that financial metaphor. It also reminds us of the importance or the power of compounding. Mm-hmm. And actually, as much as I don't want people to major in the minors, if we do find those small, simple, effective tools and apply them consistently, that doesn't mean perfectly, doesn't necessarily mean every day over time, that really has this compounding positive effect. And, and if you think about that, what does that mean socially? I'm so convinced kind of in terms of relationships that it is all about quality over quantity. Yes. There's a bit of a kind of bias in there, a confirmation bias for me because I travel a lot with my role and I'm married, we've got 2 kids. And so I kind of have to try and emphasize that quality over quantity. I certainly don't always get it right, but I've seen the value. I've got 2 sons now, they're 10 and 13. And over the years, just consistently investing that quality time, even if it isn't huge amounts of time, that really does add up to make a big difference. And thankfully, I've got a great relationship with them now, even though there's been periods where I've been away a lot. And I think that's true, physically in terms of our, it's better to do half an hour regularly than 3 hours rarely. In terms of your exercise, in terms of nutrition, 80-20, better to have kind of eating well most of the time rather than kind of perfectly once in a while. And I think that general principle of progress over perfection, taking the long view, looking for those compounding actions, not sweating the small stuff too much. Again, it's like, this Instagram influencers, TikTokers, they love this idea of the small things are the big things. Get up and make your bed and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, yeah, maybe. But again, sometimes the small things are just a distraction and a waste of effort. Sometimes and you're actually better to focus on the things that make a big difference. So sometimes the small things are the small things and you should just forget about them. Yeah. But anyway, I could go on and on. I'm getting all
this
kind
is
of
fantastic, mate. It's like this world of FOMO. It's like we all feel like everybody else is living this life of perfection and everything else. And I think one of the gifts of being a cynical Australian is I've never looked at anybody else thinking, oh yeah, they've got it dialed. I'm always nitpicking going, yeah. Well, what's really going on here?
Yeah, what's the truth?
Often the loudest person in the room screaming how we're meant to be living. I'm like, what's really going behind behind that charade that I'm seeing? But mate, I love our chats. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, likewise.
Just I seriously, I just looked at the clock. I'm like, wow, what? We're well over an hour. I don't know. I feel like I've got like a list of questions here. I'm like, hang on, I haven't even really looked at my notes. I've just let this one go, mate, because it's just so fantastic. And is there anything else you'd like to say before? I feel like you've given me so much. I don't know if I've missed anything.
We could have kept going, couldn't we? Well, I really appreciate the opportunity just to have a conversation and share it with the audience too. And I hope they enjoy it as much as I have. It's just been great to have that kind of free flowing discussion. And
chat, mate. When's your book coming out? What's the plan with that?
So it's going to be August next year. I'm actually working with an American publisher, and and so basically it's going to talk about all the topics that we discussed, and how do we take a kind of healthier approach to high performance. Essentially, it's a kind of a distillation of these ideas, looking at how we can kind of thrive in this always-on world, but in a way that isn't polarized into the kind of hustle culture or the kind of resignation of quiet quitting. And looking at how we start our day, our work days, how we switch off at the end of the day, sleep, fitness, nutrition, and then really digging into kind of this stuff around mindset and this really different view of looking at self-improvement through that lens of self-determination theory, rather than it being about being self-centered. So I think if you enjoy this conversation as a kind of listener, I think you'll enjoy the book. And as I said, that'll be in bookstores and online next August.
Can't wait for the book, mate. I just, having a conversation with you just makes you feel like it's going to be okay. Do you know what I mean?
That's good to hear. I'm pleased you feel like that.
It's going to be okay. Sometimes we feel like we've all got to be pushing. And it's like, I don't know. I said to somebody in the office today, like last week, I'm like, yeah, I didn't get much done today. And I think they were like taken aback, right? Like I'm the VP of whatever, and they're a little bit more junior in the company. And I said, yeah, I didn't get much done today. I really didn't feel very productive. They're like, what? I'm like, yeah, but I'm okay with it. Some days I'm really productive. So, I'm going to go home and hug my kids.
Absolutely. And it's a journey of growth, isn't it? That's such a cliche, but it is. And I can so relate to what you've said, and also relate to really struggling with that.
Yeah.
Being kind to myself, self-compassion, not just staying locked in at work. I basically wrote the book because it's all the stuff I struggle with. And it seems like quite a few people struggle with it as well. I did not write it from the point of view of, I've perfected it. I've completed it. It's definitely a work in progress.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to, maybe when you're over here doing your book tour, we'll get you in person. I'd love you to even talk to the company here.
That'd be
I've
great.
organised Tommy Wood to be one of our end of year speakers this year, so he's coming down.
Oh, brilliant! So, Tommy's brilliant. He's
a great guy. So you're both similar fields, so probably too hard to have both of you this year. But too many science, neuroscience, and above the shoulders people.
Yeah.
But anyway, mate, this has been fantastic. Again, really appreciate you, James. Fantastic. Congrats again on completing your PhD, writing the book. All your keynote speakers. If people want to get in touch with you to have be involved with your work, how do they contact you?
So feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'm quite active there, and you can find me on LinkedIn, also on Instagram where I'm not quite so active. And then I've also got my website, which is jameshewittperformance.com, and you could sign up to my newsletter there as well. So all the usual suspects for someone with a digital platform. But we'd welcome the opportunity to connect with people and continue the conversation if anyone's got any other questions or ideas they want to share.
Perfect. All right, mate. Really appreciate you, buddy. For everybody listening, you can find all the show notes, timestamps, and everything else at bennettendurance.com/media. All right, stay on the line, buddy. Cheers.